I just want to comment on the title of this, Reality, Grief, Hope, Prophetic Witness in a Change of Era. Also, ironically, this morning, in Give Us This Day, which is a prayer piece it's a daily readings that I read, Walter Brueggemann was the commentary. And I'm using Walter Brueggemann's material today. So much of what we'll reflect on is an opening and an entryway into Walter Brueggemann's work by the book titled Reality, Grief, Hope. So if you have not, if you're interested in Walter Brueggemann's work and his commentary where he juxtaposes the Hebrew scriptures with our contemporary moment, it's just, for Americans, it's a profound juxtaposition because he wrote post 9/11 and juxtaposed the event of 9/11 with the loss of the temple. And so he does really amazing connections and commentary. So what he speaks about from the Hebrew scriptures is that the tasks, there's 3 urgent tasks for prophetic communities. One is the reality and the grief and the hope. And we'll go into that in much more depth. And so we're situating this in a change of era. I don't think any of us can sit here today and think that anything is stable.
Right.
In our personal lives, in our religious life, in our church, in our world, we are in the midst of this profound change of era. In 2015, I think it was, Pope Francis was speaking to a group of bishops in the Tuscan region of Italy. And he made this observation that we are not living in a change of era, or in an era of change, but rather a change of era. So we're not living at a time when some things are changing. And we're not living at a time when there's a little tweak here and a little tweak there, and we find subtle differences. We are really living at a time of an epochal change. And historically, this happens about every 500 years. So we just have the good fortune of being alive this time. So although this is our first time to experience a change of era, the world, humanity, the earth has experienced and lived through these changes of era before us. And a change of era is when everything is changing. Not one stone stands on another. Everything is changing. So you think about, just pause for a moment and give some thought to what are the ways that, if you think about when you entered this life, if you want to use that as the juxtaposition, or maybe think about 40, 50 years ago, the kinds of changes that you've experienced and the impact, not only the impact of those discrete changes, but the impact of all of those changes taken together, the cumulative impact. Oftentimes we say it's progress. So when you just think about communications, the changes that we've experienced in communications, in our capacities to connect. And so in a 2011 interview with Krista Tippett. Krista Tippett is an American journalist, and she works in the intersection of culture, faith, basically culture and faith. And so all of her work, she has a podcast she writes. All of her work is really looking at this intersection of culture and faith. And in 2011, she interviewed Walter Brueggemann. And he made this observation, which he makes in his writings, that the world we have trusted in is vanishing before our eyes. And the world that is coming at us feels like a threat to us, and we can't quite see the shape of it. When I first encountered that, it named something for me. It named a way to engage and understand sometimes the sadness that I was feeling, the losses, the confusion, and the lack of clarity. And so when you think about, what is anybody living the life that you expected 40 years ago, 50 years ago? I am not living the life I expected. And yet we are living a deeply profound witness that does not look like what we expected. And so part of our work, I think, as religious, alive at this time, is to meet this moment, to meet this change of era, to meet this uncertainty, and to meet what is ahead that we will never see, to meet it with profound hope and a profound witness of who we are and why we are. So I want to look at the three movements of reality, grief, and hope. These urgent tasks for prophetic communities. And when we talk about prophetic communities, this is not just us. This is not just religious communities. This is the Christian communities. These are communities that bring a prophetic presence. And what Walter Brueggemann says, the first task is to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion. Tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion. And if you can you see the cartoon? So on the one line, there's a stand, and lots of people congregate, in line to go to this booth. And the booth is titled Comforting Lies. And the booth that is titled Unpleasant Truths, nobody is there. And so this real work of naming truth, speaking truth in a society that lives in illusion, is the first task. And the second task is to grieve in a society that practices denial. To grieve in a society that practices denial. This image of two women sitting side by side, and the quote, "I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her name was grief." I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her name was grief. It's attributed to C.S. Lewis in his writing in his book, A Grief Observed, which is his really a memoir and a kind of an autobiography of the loss of his wife and after her death. And so, this is something that we are so uncomfortable with, is this grieving. And I'm going to break that open in our second session of the importance of grieving. And the third task is express hope in a society that lives in despair. You can look anywhere and there's despair. And in a rational way, we can say that the despair will overpower the hope. And the work of the spiritual life, the spiritual life, which is our work, we are given to a spiritual life. So the work of the spiritual life is to allow that hope to overcome despair. And I say that without any understanding of how that happens without grace. That it is pure grace. It is not something that we decide we're going to do or have a formula for, but it is something that we create our interior disposition to make space for, to receive the grace, to manifest hope. So I want to just walk through a bit about, I want to look at this reality a little closer. And I am going to be speaking from, which you probably know better than I do, the American context. And I want you to reflect on your context. And the American context, as you know, is dangerous right now. It's so utterly dangerous. And when I was preparing for this, to be with you today, and I was working with this content, and I've worked with this content before in the past and with other groups. And I thought, well, I want to go back to that and look at the context that we are in now and see what to tweak. And I discovered there's very little to tweak, because this context has been as it is. What we'll unpack in this is almost timeless. What I discover is each time I go back to the content, I'm different, and it reveals something different to me. It's like a scripture. The words don't change, but the circumstances that I bring to it change. So I want to work first with why would we tell the truth? And what is the importance of telling the truth? John Sobrino is a Jesuit who lived for years, and I think he continues to live in Central America, and he has written from, he's done theological exploration from a Central American context. He's lived through the regimes, the dictatorships in Central America. And he speaks about the importance of telling the truth is that we have a responsibility to be honest toward reality, particularly when that reality is painful and involves suffering. And I would say particularly when it involves not just our own suffering, but the suffering of others, that we have an obligation to be honest, to be truthful. And he goes further to say that the problem of being honest toward reality in the broader social context stems from the problem of being honest toward one's own reality. If we cannot be honest and truthful about our own reality, personal, communal, we will never be able to be truthful and honest about other realities. So our personal truth-telling, whatever that looks like in our lives, honesty toward ourselves, toward others, our personal truth-telling is a building block of any kind of truth-telling that we want to see beyond ourselves in society. So when you think of of what we are seeing, which is the illusion and the denial, that doesn't start at those systemic levels. It starts at very personal and practical levels and is built over time. And so it's so important to claim our truth, to speak our truth, to speak a truth to ourselves and others. So when we do that, we are contributing to the social justice that is our personal acts of justice and truth-telling, or building blocks for communal acts of justice and truth-telling. So I want to just look at this illusions and what we're seeing in terms of what's at stake here. Because the machine is constructing an illusion. Walter Brueggemann, he juxtaposes the empire and the neighborhood. And we'll go into that a little bit, but there's forces of empire that have constructed illusions that we take for reality. And the mechanisms of constructing illusion is disinformation, misinformation. gaslighting, fake news, deep fake videos, all of those things that we're seeing. You know, I was fascinated. There is I think it's 2 or 3 countries, I think it's Netherlands, Sweden, and either Denmark or Norway, that have built into their curriculum the education of their children to be able to identify fake news. It's at that level that whole countries see a need for a curriculum to help this generation identify what is true and what is not true. Oops, sorry. And so they're teaching ways to deconstruct the illusion. They're teaching children how to do a bias check. What are the signs that you can, when you're looking at a story, when you're looking at a news story, how can you tell, is it real, is it not real? When you're looking at an image, is it AI generated, is it real? So they're really, you know, the ways to deconstruct the illusion, which is in service to truth-telling, is to really check our own biases. I was just in a conversation yesterday, and we were talking about where to get news. And in the United States right now, it has always been difficult to get global news. Now it is equally, if not more difficult to get our domestic news from our primary news outlets because they are being propagandized. So CBS, which was one of the premier, most respected news networks, was bought by Paramount. And Paramount needed a deal that needed government approval. And so Paramount started to manage the 60 Minutes newscast that was one of the most respected newscasts for decades. And so Paramount is telling 60 Minutes what they can and cannot do in their reporting, because they have done a lot of the exposés on political reporting. They are, if they're biased, and I will say no news outlet is unbiased, but if they are biased, it is a bias toward the people rather than a bias toward the machine. And so, so now 60 Minutes, all of their leaders have resigned out of integrity. That newscast cannot be trusted any longer. The comedian Stephen Colbert, who, comedy is an act of resistance. So Stephen Colbert has been canceled. He is one of the most vocal comedians who really takes reality, finds the humor in it, but in doing that raises and elevates a truth. So he's been canceled, and that happened maybe a week after Paramount bought CBS. So when you think about where you get your news, one of the tools to consider is follow the money. Follow the money. Who's funding what? And why? Who pays for what? And who doesn't pay for what? So follow the money. So this work, it's real, it's this deconstructing illusion is the truth-telling. And this takes work. So I want to explore what are some characteristics of this moment, of this change of era. And on this, you'll see on this photo where this young man is holding a sign that says, everything is connected. Everything is connected in life, and the point is to understand it, to know it, and to understand it. And I will say this is, to see the connections I think this is one of the most important capacities, is to see the connections between things that we think are discrete and separate. And this is our prophetic work. I want to say this is prophetic work, because there is a mystical capacity to be able to note connections, to see patterns, and to make meaning. So I just want to run through probably about 6 or 7 things, experiences, that are the profound disruptions that create this change of era. So the first I would name is the decline of our institutions, our civil, our democratic, and our religious institutions. And we could be saying this has been happening. This is not something that's just happening. This has been happening for decades. So this change of era is not something that just erupts. It's a slow boil. So we see globally, and I see sadly in my own country just how fragile our democracy has been. Utterly fragile. That it could be on the verge of the collapse that it's on. And it reminds us that our civil institutions, they are only as strong as the commitments and the promises that we make to one another, and the fidelity to those promises. Our civil institutions require the fidelity of anyone involved in them. And what we're seeing in the United States is an utter disregard for the fidelity to our social institutions, to one another. And that is how fragile we are. And I would say it's any social agreement really relies on the goodwill and the fidelity of those making that agreement. So we also see, I think a characteristic here is the weaponization of religion. We see this everywhere. We're seeing it certainly in the United States, and I think I would say this also throughout Europe, the rise of white Christian nationalism. That is really the marriage of a bastardization of Christianity with a political party. So the marriage of distorted Christianity and the distorted gospel with political power creates the white Christian nationalism movement. And in the United States, I don't know about here or throughout Europe, but this is not something that Catholics are immune from. We are contributing wholeheartedly to this. So there's pockets of this white Christian nationalism throughout all dimensions of Christianity. We see the weaponization of religion. We see it in the Middle East, the tragedy of Gaza. I mean, the horror of what is happening, and the use of religion to really justify what is taking place. We see economic volatility and collapse. We're seeing that in spades in the United States right now. And globally, the impact of the tariffs that have been unilaterally, that have just been unilaterally called. Interesting, as I was leaving the States earlier last week, our Supreme Court, our courts had just deemed the tariffs illegal, which we always knew, but we needed a a court judgment. And the Trump administration has now gone to the Supreme Court to appeal that. And so the precariousness of this, the volatility of the global economic, not just in the United States, but it's globally. We see climate collapse. We're seeing more and more devastating climate events than we've ever seen before. In the United States, about 2 months ago, we saw the horrific flooding in Texas, where the camps, these summer camps of young children, were flooded, and the loss of life was. Any loss of life is tragic, but the cumulative loss of life, with the knowledge that could have been prevented, and the knowledge that the force of that flooding and the origin of that flooding and its force was enabled by human complicity to really, and that's the denial. We see a global racial justice movement. I think, what I so appreciate coming here is that every public gathering begins with your acknowledgement of country, which I think is something that is only the religious communities in the United States are beginning to be able to acknowledge. But that long, long work of racial justice it's still in, and it's all connected. When you think about the climate, the collapse of the climate, and the economic volatility and collapse, who is most affected? It's racial minorities. It's the poor. It's women. So everything is connected. We see forced migration, detention, and deportation of migrants, and this, I'm sure you've seen this in the United States. It's stunning to me that when I watch sometimes, and I think, what does it feel like to be utterly, utterly unwanted on this earth? To have no place to call home on this earth. And then, these prolonged conflicts and violence. The conflict in the Middle East has been decades. We have other areas in the globe that we have prolonged conflict, prolonged violence. And, John Paul Lederach is he's actually a peace, I wouldn't say he's an activist, he's a peace builder. Most recently, I think he's been teaching at Notre Dame, but he has a long career of being a peace builder in areas of the world that have protracted violence. And what he found as he did this work, the traditional peacekeeping work, the traditional treaty building work, what he found is that all of that work took place at these upper levels where leaders were negotiating. But the conflict, the violence, the damage was all being experienced on the ground where the people were living. And not once in the treaty building or the peace building did the leaders listen to those on the ground. And so, of course, their treaties collapsed. Their peace pacts collapsed. And then he began to observe, and it was the women. He began to observe around some tribal conflict in Africa, where the women from both tribes basically said, we are preserving our marketplace. This will not be a place of violence. And so the women first they carved out the marketplace because that was common space. Both tribes had to go to the marketplace. And so the women made it safe. Then they carved out other social spaces that were shared social spaces. And the women made the pacts. And if you don't think women run the world, their husbands and sons would not cross them. And so what Lederach writes about is the ways that peace happens and the response to conflict. If we think conflicts are going on and on forever, look to where the conflict is being negotiated and how it's being negotiated. In the United States, by law, slavery was abolished in 1865, by law. There was absolutely no effort or no work to actually create different spaces and create the relationships that would allow that law, that would reflect that law. And so what we began to see, particularly in the South, is that immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation, we began to see laws that would say, well, freed slaves, can only live here. You're free, but you're going to carve out this space. This space is carved for you. So we began to see the Jim Crow laws. So in a sense, were the slaves free technically? Yes. Was there an ability to be free in the way to be able to live a free life? No, because so many other constrictions were made. So there was really no effort to do the hard work on the ground after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And that is why we continue to see in the United States, again, that's one of the causes, that's what white Christian nationalism is about. It's about, hiding behind religion to say that some people are less than, because the racial justice movement is very strong. So all of these are connected. And so we ask ourselves, how did we get here? So I want to show an image. And I want you to just take a moment and take as long as we're going to take a couple minutes, and I want you to notice what you see in this image. And I'm just going to take a couple people. What do you see?
A woman's head.
A woman's head. What is it? A young woman? An old woman? A young woman. What does anything else? An old woman. So do you see the? It's an ambiguous image. And both are right. And sometimes we see and focus on one thing and are not able to see or focus on the other. And sometimes we're in conversation with people and we might be thinking we're talking about the same thing, but we're talking about two different things. So what is it when we see things whole? There was I think it was in, I should have checked this, but I think it was in, well, I'm not even going to say. I know that it is a Ernest Hemingway novel where a character asks another character, how did you go broke? And the character says 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. That's how, and I think in many ways, that is how we have got to where we are in our current reality, gradually and then suddenly. But once we see all that there is to see, we can't unsee it. So once we have this sense and an awareness about the interconnectedness of just what we were looking at, once we understand and see that kind of interconnectedness, we can't unsee the connections. And so it allows us, it calls us to name our reality differently. It's a more complex reality. It's a more fragile reality. And it's a reality that is healed by prophetic presence. I think it can only be healed by a spiritual revolution and a prophetic presence at that. So I want to take a look at this reality. And I know, gentlemen, you're here, and I really did try to find some data on the historical presence of religious brothers and priests in Australia, but I was not able to. So I want to, as we were looking at the globe, I also want to take a look at the reality of religious life. So if you can see this, I know it's a little mathematical, but I think you get the image. Is that the presence of the first 5 Sisters of Charity, thank you very much, Linda. The presence of women religious in Australia began in 1838 with 5 sisters. 5. And then through the years, you see, and the markers that I was able to find was around 1880, there were about 815. And then it rose to about 5,000 or 3622. I mean, it was kind of like this broad range. But probably by the 1900s, and you see you're growing, the presence of religious grows until about the mid-60s to the early 70s, and that's your peak. And what I found was the peak of 14,622. This is about the same, it's the same curve that we see in the United States. So your peak was 14,622 sisters, and then the number of sisters began to decline. Until the most recent data I was able to find was in 2020 or 2021, about 3,500 religious. And so what I want to say about this is that there is truth in here that I think we need to unpack. Because we have been living an illusion. We have been living in a narrative that talks about only diminishment. And that narrative is written around the peak of religious life in our countries. So in the United States, the peak was in the hundreds of thousands in 1965. We saw the same curve and the same decline. But the story we tell, the story that gets told about religious life, is that we are doing nothing but declining. Because the reference point is only that peak. And that peak is the anomaly. So the truth is, yes, there are fewer sisters, brothers, priests in the United States and in Australia. That is true. And what is also true is that we began very small, and we are here to do what we are able to affect was what was needed in society. And so to be able to tell a story about religious life from only the anomaly is an illusion. But to tell the story of religious life, the whole story, that is a fuller truth. And so you see where these building blocks, and so what is the discipline that we might need to develop to be able to probe for truth? Could be a discipline of, what kind of critical thinking, what kind of critical questions do we need to be asking ourselves? Do we need to be asking others to be able to speak truth? So one of the reasons I offer this is that I think that the diminishment narrative that indicates that the norm was the peak, I think it is fundamentally one of the most I think what it does, I think it is the driver for whatever ambivalence we feel about our life, whatever ambivalence we feel about religious life. Because the story is that we're not enough. The story we hear is that we can't do this, we're not enough, we don't have enough. There's not enough of us anymore. Because the story begins at the peak, it doesn't begin at the beginning. And so if there's nothing that we take from our own reality, I would just urge you to really take, to really reflect on what difference would it make if if we understood our norm to be few in numbers. And the peak is the anomaly. Because what we have enough for is what God needs us for. So what was happening in this country and in my own country is that the education and the healthcare and the social safety nets were all being built. That was really kind of the humanization of society that happened over centuries. And now what's needed is something different. Our societies don't need institutions anymore. They still need to be humanized. And so the invitation is to think about what will humanize, what is needed to humanize now, and what is our contribution to that. And that's a fuller truth. So I want to pause, and we have about 35 minutes before we take a break. And if anybody needs a break, please do that. If you need to do a bathroom break, please do that. But we will take a formal break at 11. So what I'd like you to do is just for a couple minutes, jot some notes. What resonates with you? What challenges you? But most importantly, what else is important to you to name about our current reality? What else would you add to this? How else would you talk about our current reality?